So I'm going to be talking about the vocabulary of the Latin translation of The Hobbit. And I'm not going to be looking at the individual translation choices, but instead I'm going to zoom way out and look at the entire vocabulary of the work as a whole. Um, you don't have to be particularly interested in Latin, hopefully, to get something out of this talk, because a lot of the ideas that I talk about are relevant to any translation. This is somewhat of a clash of worlds for me giving this talk. I have two quite separate research interests, one of which relates to historical language learning, where most of my focus is on ancient Greek, but I research vocabulary acquisition and write software for building graded readers and custom vocabulary lists and stuff like that. And on the other hand, I run the Digital Tolkien project, which has to do with text preparation and markup and annotation of Tolkien's works for linguistic and stylistic analysis. But this talk is really, for the first time, combining these two, which is quite fun for me. So if we take a step back and think about the reasons that we translate literary works into other languages, I think there's basically three distinct reasons for doing so, although they can somewhat overlap. The reason that the works of Tolkien might be translated into German or Spanish or Finnish, languages like that, is really to make them accessible to a new group of people who are native speakers of that target language. Why shouldn't native speakers of any language be able to read the works of Tolkien in their own language? So there's that whole accessibility motivation. But there's a second motivation, which is language revitalization. When we translate the works of Tolkien into things like Welsh or Hawaiian or Maori, it's not so much because it's making the works available to a new group of people, but instead it's really about revitalizing minority and endangered languages and growing the body of works that people are able to read in those languages. In the case of things like Hawaiian and Maori and Welsh, speakers of those languages are probably perfectly capable of reading English translations. But having those works in languages like Hawaiian, Maori, or Welsh just does wonderful things for the language itself. And then there's a third category, which really motivates historical language translations like the Latin translation that I'm talking about. Sonali mentioned earlier in answer to a question that she's glad there isn't a Sanskrit translation, but I personally would love to see a Sanskrit translation for this reason of language learning. That when works like The Hobbit are translated into languages like Latin, it gives an opportunity for people that are learning that language to have additional works to read. And I'll talk a bit more about why that's important. I do want to give a quick shout out to the amazing work that Michael Everson does at Evertype in publishing translations of The Hobbit in particular into minority and endangered languages. He's doing wonderful work there. But I'm going to be talking about Hobbitus Ille, the Latin translation that was done by Mark Walker and was published in 2012. In his introduction from the translator, Walker calls out various reasons why The Hobbit is suitable for translation into a language like Latin. One of his arguments is that because of the setting, there aren't that many modern objects and so on, that it makes it much easier to translate into a historical language like Latin than a lot of other works would be. So he translated The Hobbit into Latin. He also, in his book, provides a list of the proper names, the novel words that he had to come up with where there wasn't an appropriate Latin word. We'll talk about that in a moment. In translating the verse, he tried to pay attention to Latin verse styles as well. Now, the translation has been somewhat criticized, and in fact, most translations of fiction into Latin get criticized in various ways. There tends to be two types of criticisms that get made, and this applies to Hobbitus Ille, it applies to the Harry Potter translations, and a range of other translations. One criticism, which I think is a more serious one, is where there are actual mistakes made in the target language. The wrong word is used, the wrong case is used. And there are certainly issues like that in Hobbitus Ille. But there's another category of criticism, and that's to do with whether the translation captures the literary style as opposed to being more learner targeted. And this is a criticism, the criticism has been made of Hobbitus Ille and the Harry Potter translations that they aren't good literary Latin. And sometimes Winnie the Pooh translation, Winnie Ille Pooh, is proclaimed as a great example of good literary Latin. But there's a trade-off between good literary Latin and Latin that's appropriate for learners. And so I don't actually think that it's a fair criticism if a translator is deliberately intending the work to be for language learners. But regardless of all these criticisms, either of the types of criticisms I mentioned, most of them don't really apply to what I want to talk about today, which is just the overall vocabulary learning and whether a work like Hobbitus Ille is helpful for students wanting to build their Latin vocabulary. I want to briefly say something about the novel words that Mark Walker invented or repurposed. In some cases, he had to come up with entirely new words. In other cases, he repurposed an existing Latin word, but used it for some new sense. And so this table that I'm showing here is showing for each chapter of The Hobbit, how many novel words get introduced in that chapter, along with some examples. So obviously he had to come up with a word for Hobbit, but he also had to come up with words like tobacco and clarinet and handkerchief, and post office and so on, gunpowder, all these sorts of things that they weren't necessarily existing Latin words for. Sometimes he repurposed things. For example, curia in chapter 10, translating town hall. And you'll see that there's a lot of new words introduced in the first chapter, and then it gradually declines. There's a bit of a bump in chapter 6 because there's a lot of description of flora in particular that needed to be translated. Coming back to the question of why it's helpful to have translations of things like The Hobbit into languages like Latin, it really comes down to a fundamental idea that I think most second language acquisition researchers would agree with, that a crucial and necessary ingredient for the acquisition of language is comprehensible input. And what that means is repeated familiar vocabulary in context, texts that the language learner is motivated to read, that has just the right amount of new words and familiar words. And a lot of research has been done on this in the last few decades, particularly by people like Paul Nation. And there's basically different levels of understanding of a text that are appropriate for different approaches to that text. Texts can be too easy for the student. They just lack, they don't have the motivation because it is too easy. There are texts that are the right level for speed reading, for developing reading fluency rather than vocabulary building, say. There are texts that are good for extensive reading, which is really where the heart of vocabulary building happens. There's not much work required to understand those texts. There will be occasionally words that are new, but generally understandable in context. And then there's this whole level of sort of intensive reading where you have to spend more effort to really work out what's going on with the text. And in many cases, that requires a certain amount of scaffolding of the vocabulary. And then you get texts that are just too hard or require too much scaffolding. There's just too much that the student doesn't know, and it's just too much effort. They're not going to learn anything new. But in order to evaluate any text for these different purposes, we need to break down what the vocabulary of that text is. And so the first process that I undertook in doing this research is a process of lemmatization. So in any highly inflected language like Latin, you really need to map all of the different inflected forms that exist into their dictionary head word. So for example, if you take a word like wagus, which is what Mark Walker used for wag, that shows up in pretty much all of the possible noun inflections. And you don't want to treat those words as separate, at least in the context of vocabulary. You might want to treat them separately to a certain extent for morphological acquisition. But in terms of whether you know the word wag or wagus, you want to treat all of the different inflected forms as essentially the same word. And that means going through the text and doing that mapping. And so that was an automated process that I did using the Stanza library from Stanford. And I'm also grateful to Francesco Mambrini from the European Research Council's Linking Latin project, and also Helma Dick at the University of Chicago for some of their data. This automated mapping, this automated lemmatization is not perfect. Proper names are particularly problematic. There's also an issue with the fact that a work like Hobbitus Ille uses modern punctuation, which most Latin texts don't. And so the tools, the machine learning tools that have been trained on traditional Latin texts don't quite know what to do with things like exclamation marks and quotations and so on. So even though I did this in an automated fashion, it can be corrected over time. I already have made a bunch of corrections since I did the initial automated lemmatization. And the numbers I'm going to show in a moment are still broadly correct. They may change a little bit here and there as things get corrected. So just to start off with some sort of high-level numbers. The left-hand column is the Latin numbers, the right-hand column is the English numbers. So in terms of pure tokens, the actual number of sort of space-separated words, if you like, in the text, depending on how you count it and how you deal with hyphenated words and stuff like that, the English text has about 96,500 tokens. The Latin text has fewer, only 71,000. And that just says something about the compactness of Latin in using case endings instead of prepositions and so on in many cases. But if you look at the number of types, in other words, the number of unique forms that exist in the text, Latin is much higher, and that's because of these inflections, right? Instead of wag appearing in just the singular and plural, you've got all the different cases as well as singular and plural. So you end up with 14,000 different unique forms in the Latin versus 6,000. But when it comes down to lemmas, the dictionary head words, just wag instead of all the different inflections, you end up with roughly 6,500 lemmas in the Latin, and 4,775 in the English. The difference there is interesting. I haven't really dug into why that might be, but it is interesting that the Latin does make use of considerably more lemmas. Now, lemmas are not all equally frequent. In fact, they're not at all equally frequent. There are a handful of words that appear many, many times and a lot of words that appear only once. In fact, there are 3,000 lemmas in the Latin that only appear once in the whole book, and 2,000 in the English. But there are 3 Latin words that appear over 2,000 times and 8 English words that appear more than 2,000 times. And I've included sort of the top list on the left and right. You can see the Latin words there on the left and the English words on the right. You can see the only proper noun there is Bilbo. His name appears about 520 times in both texts. But you'll see that most of the other words are function words. They're not content words. And that turns out to be quite significant in terms of evaluating how many words you need to be able to read a text. Because you may think, looking at this sort of distribution, what's often referred to as a Zipfian distribution, that there are only a handful of words that appear so many times. So if you just want to understand half the words on the page, you probably don't need to learn that many words. The problem is that they tend not to be the words that convey the most meaning. So just as a little bit of an experiment, I thought I'd show you what it would look like trying to read the English Hobbit if you only knew enough words to cover 50% of the words on the page. I've included the word Hobbit here because obviously that's a new word even for English speakers. But you can see, in the, there, a Hobbit, not a, with a, of, and a, nor yet a, with a, you've got no idea what's going on. If you expand it to try to get 80% coverage, you start to get a better sense of what's going on, particularly because the word hole starts to appear. So there's a hole in the ground and a Hobbit lived there. But really, there's still no description at all of what kind of hole it is. All of the really interesting descriptive material is in that long tail of words that appear much less often. By 90%, you can start to get a sense of the sorts of things that the hole is and isn't. 95%, you get more. By the time you get to 98%, you're only missing one word. It's the word oozy, and you can guess from the context what that means. So coming back to our levels of understanding, what researchers like Paul Nation have shown is that for extensive reading, you really need to be at the 95 to 98% level. That's where you can comfortably read a text and pick up new words, the meaning of new words just from the context. But that does require a lot of words to be able to understand a novel such as Hobbitus Ille. And here's a chart showing that for the entire book. Even to get to the 50% stage, you would need to learn 117 lemmas for the entire book. Even just chapter 1 would be 110 lemmas. And you can see that to achieve a level like 95%, we're talking about 3,000 lemmas for the entire book. So this is not a work that a beginning Latin student would be able to tackle. And even an intermediate student would not be able to read it at an extensive reading level for quite some time. There would need to be quite a considerable amount of scaffolding. But of the words that it does use, are they the kinds of words that are useful for wanting to read other types of Latin? Or if you have been exposed to a lot of other types of Latin, how easy is it to read The Hobbit? So one of the things that I did was I looked at the Dickinson College Commentaries Core Latin list, which they've compiled the 1,000 most common words in Latin across a corpus of Latin works that are typically read by students. And I looked at, in this case, the top 60. So I looked at the top 60 nouns in The Hobbit and looked to see if they're in the DCC Core Latin list. And you can see that the vast majority of them are. There are proper names, obviously, like Bilbo and Thorin and Gandalf and Gollum and Balin that we can't really do anything with, even English speakers encountering those for the first time. The words that appear a lot in The Hobbit that don't appear a lot in other Latin texts are things like the word for dwarf and elf and dragon and cobweb. There are some interesting ones like ring. Annulus is a real Latin word, but it's not nearly as common in general Latin. Even the word for door, Janua, is much more common in The Hobbit than it is in normal Latin texts. Looking at verbs, the situation is actually much better. The most common 20 verbs in The Hobbit are all in the Dickinson core list. Even the one that isn't, clamo, it's not hugely common in literary Latin texts, but it does tend to get taught very early on in textbooks, which is interesting. So just to sort of finish up before turning to questions, with this sort of information, there's a lot that can be done. One is to sort of visualize what parts of the text are potentially problematic for different levels of Latin. Here I've done just a color coding based on frequency, but you could also do this sort of thing in a custom reading environment based on student knowledge. And this is actually one of the things that I do with Ancient Greek, is track what words students have seen and be able to identify texts that are readable given that knowledge, highlight words that they may not have seen before, and so on. And obviously, in an online reading environment, we could do additional things like allow students to hover over a word to get glosses, or queue up new words that they're seeing for the first time in a spaced repetition system. So next steps for this sort of work. One thing I'm wanting to do is word level alignment. So take the English and the Latin and actually line up which Latin words correspond to which English words, which will be interesting from a lot of sort of querying of what English words get translated to what in Latin and vice versa. I do want to do a deeper comparison with the vocabulary lists in textbooks and the DCC. One of the things that will be then possible is the production of per chapter vocabulary lists. So I'm now reading chapter 5 of Hobbitus Ille. What are the words that I haven't seen before that I need to learn? Or what are the words not in my textbook that I'll need to learn to be able to read that particular chapter? But at the end of the day, the sheer amount of vocabulary, even in this translation that was intended for Latin learners, it still means that we probably need simplified paraphrases. I would love to see a sort of simplified version of The Hobbit that really restricts the vocabulary a lot further down. And of course, everything that I'm talking about with regard to Latin could apply to other historical languages as well, not just historical languages. This applies to really any use of translations of literature for the purposes of language learning. One final thing I'll just mention that was interesting. So I didn't do word level alignment yet, but I did align at the paragraph level. And in the process of matching up the paragraphs in the English and the Latin, I found that there were actually a bunch of paragraphs missing that were not translated in the Latin. But that raises an interesting point, along with the criticisms that I brought up at the top, at the start of the talk, which is what do we do about criticisms that are made of translations? This has come up a couple of times in previous talks. How do we improve the process? How do we fix translations that are already out there? And are corrections realistically possible for these smaller market translations? Obviously, we've talked about a bunch of translations where there's been an opportunity for a second translation to emerge, or a 15th translation in the case of the Russian. But is that even possible in something like Latin or Welsh or Maori, where there's just so much of a smaller market?